Cool.
Okay, we're recording. So this is building query, April 24. And the rough agenda, which I'm happy to edit with you kind of live now, is, well, we talked about walking through some of the RFCs, requests for comment process that we've set up for contributors and users. And I also kind of promised that we talk a little bit about private networks and where those fit in, at least for a couple minutes, to some people who are interested in that couldn't make the call. And then beyond that, it's also our Sprint H demo, so we can and should demo anything we are ready to. And also I want to welcome Arshwin, a new query contributor. Welcome. Everybody else here is a query team member for your info. Anything else, B5?
I think that's it. We've got a lot on the docket in terms of RFCs to talk about. And Ashwin, you're sort of looking for a point to jump in. So that, I think what might be helpful there is if you actually just, I don't know how long you have. If you're in a rush, then we can make sure we cover that right now. But otherwise, these RFCs are actually a great chance to sort of see what's going on. I know you're interested in a bunch of the SQL stuff, and that might pan out as well. But you could maybe hear what's going on here. We just lost power for a hot second. It's back. Yeah, and we can see how it goes. But we do have a lot of, in terms of demos for the sprint was really focused on like technical debt management. So like, Casey, unless you want to demonstrate the thousands of lines of desktop code that you moved that changed nothing. I think the biggest announcement that we have is we cut a release during this sprint that fixes export. And everyone should know that export from Query Desktop now works the way that it should. And we have solved a lot of sort of bugs and problems around specific data sets that were made with specific versions of Query and those not working. We've got a lot of those sort of like bits dialed in. So I think that's pretty much the only like exciting stuff from this sprint. But
sorry.
Yeah.
So we fixed the major export bug, but it wasn't until after we cut the release that I ended up fixing that weird folder within zip file thing. There might be more than one error or bug around that, but the one that's coming from desktop is now fixed on head and will be in the next release. But you can export data. It's just a little messy the way that everything's named right now, but that'll be fixed in the next release.
Amazing. That's super good to know. Yeah. I was running into that as well. You hit export and you'll get a folder that is named zip, and inside of that folder has the actual zip archive. That is now fixed. Yay, thanks, Case. Yeah, and as you said, Rigo, I want to make sure that we talk about private data and encrypted data before we move on, just so that that's covered for the call. The short answer for encrypted data is you can do it right now. It is much easier if query team members set it up, because the easiest way to do it is to form a private IPFS network, which is the sort of short answer for keeping data from being exposed to the broader decentralized web or to any of our sort of registries. The focus of the next sprint will land the notion of pushing to remotes in a much more sort of concrete way. A remote is anybody that is willing to accept data in our world. So for being able to collaborate with team members, being able to create a data set and push it directly to your team member or directly to a sort of like host system that you have set up to just permanently record the data that you're collaborating on is sort of the whole notion of pushing to a remote. And that is going to get much more robust in the next release of Query because we have a whole bunch of stuff to sort of clean up and deal with in that whole category of work. One of the RFCs we're going to discuss today actually addresses that directly. So the answer on private stuff, you can do it today. It's tricky. The roadmap for encrypted data, we have moved all of the it's worth noting that all of the data inside of Query is not encrypted at rest. It is, if somebody can get a hold of that data, then they have it. It's in plain text. We are planning in the future to ship the idea of encrypted data. So data that is encrypted before it's stored and has access control wrapped around it so that you can actually move that data around and only people that you sort of give control to can get at it. That is not slated until sort of Q3 and Q4 of this year. So the earliest that will land is sort of October, November, December of this year. It's going to take us a long while to get that right. We have a lot of primitives to sort of do first, and we want to make sure that when we go into encrypted data that we have a real plan and a real sort of strong set of guarantees around it when it ships. So hopefully that's an answer. Be happy to sort of talk more about this. We should definitely open up an issue to talk about encrypted data. I know we have one buried in the query repo, but we should resurface that and make sure that it's pinned as a conversation for folks looking to do either private or controlled access. Okay, I think that gets our announcements out of the way. Is that right?
That's great.
Cool. Let's move on to some RFCs. So the RFCs repo for anybody who's following along is query-io/RFCs. RFC stands for request for comments. And the reason we do request for comments is we think that anybody should be able to sort of contribute to augmenting the way the query works. And we internally at the query team also use the RFC process to propose changes to query itself. And so this is basically like, you can think of a long-term roadmap. This is more of a sort of short-term, I would like to change this feature to work this way in a concrete sort of proposal style definition. And today we have 3 that we have to talk through, which is meaty. At least 3? What are we doing? We're doing push-pull, a storage, config, and apply. So 4. We have 4 to talk about today. And so I think everybody on the query team has had a chance to read through a number of these. We definitely need to save some time for config, which is kind of a secret one, because for configuration, what we have figured out in the last 24 hours that we really need to move the private key, which is stored inside of configuration, out of the query repo. We've had a number of folks who have deleted .query and have had a lot of trouble getting back into a usable state because their private key goes with it, and then it's gone forever. And then we get into a situation that's hard to recover from. And so we want people to be able to blow away the .query directory and not have to worry about doing something that's irreversible. And so we think the shortest way to do that is to get the private key out of configuration. But I want to save that to the end, because the answer to that is something that we're going to have to kind of work out a little bit in real time. And so I think the first one we want to talk to is probably in order of creation, which starts with you, Dustin, with the apply RFC.
Sure.
So you want to sort of like kick off the changes you made since, a quick overview of what the RFC proposes and the changes you've made since we last talked about it.
Sure, totally. So the RFC itself has a lot of background information at the start, but the main thing it's trying to accomplish is fixing problems with how transforms are run when you have checked out data sets. So to go into what those terms mean, transforms are a way to run scripts against data sets, either to construct them through like web scraping or to like take one, modify it in some programmatic way, and then save a new version. And then the second feature that's involved there is checked out data sets, where you have the data set not just stored in our database-like repository, but also living as files somewhere on your hard drive. So transforms were designed before that feature existed, and it doesn't really work with the current paradigm that we're operating under. So yeah, the main thrust of this RFC is talking about a way to like disentangle running a transform from like saving a new version. And the way that works is this new command called apply that is basically like do stuff. It's hopefully more general than just solving this one specific problem. The whole thrust of this RFC is saying there's probably a class of things you can do with data sets. Running a transform is one of those. So a lot of it, like I was saying, is just talking about the background. The stuff that was most recently added is talking about suggestions for how it would look on the command line, like how it would be run. And I don't have like a final answer on it yet. Like it's still a work in progress, but I hope to land on something that feels ergonomic, such that while you're developing a transform and like trying to write your code to modify your data set in the way that you're discovering, I guess, it isn't far from that to go to like committing your work and like ending up where you want to be. Some of the more general ways of thinking about transform is that we have a nascent SQL engine part of query, and that could also be looked at as a way of like running some sort of application on a data set. Things like calculating the stats, which we do, is also something that could fall in that category. But things in the future would be like rendering visualizations, things like that, running like, you know, custom scripts that are external, maybe like machine learning pipelines, things like that. So yeah, there's still a lot of to-dos left, but we've also had some discussions in like previous meetings about how this should work and how to think about it. I think the biggest questions are around like there's a lot of unknowns around how this will work in the future, and there's a lot of questions around like what's the best way to generalize this so that it has use behind it, like so that it's useful, so it's easy to think about, like reason about. So yeah. Any questions, thoughts, objections, shrugs?
It's so hard to finish a thought and then you're in a Zoom call and it's just like this like silence. Like, has
Yeah.
anyone been listening? So to add a little bit to it, to just flesh out what I'm going to repeat a lot of what Dustin just said in another way so that it's concrete and grokkable or more grokkable. The biggest problem we were having was dry runs, right? This idea that you would do query save, and we had this notion of like dry run because we the RFC talks about this a bunch, but like we had this idea of when you save a commit with the transform component, that's when the code executes. But you get into this weird problem of you can't actually develop the code. It's really hard. It's really cumbersome to actually work on the code that is going to run, that is going to generate, that is going to automate the creation of your new commit. It's a weird and difficult thing. And so we came up with this flag called dry run. And it has a bunch of problems with it. The thing that Dustin latched onto as the like main problem is like to make dry run work properly, you need to be able to see the output of what dry run is doing. And if we're in a FSI linked folder, like we don't want to save those files. We just want to sort of preview it. We don't actually want to sort of like get at it. We don't actually want to sort of commit the details of that. That's the whole point of like a dry run. But it really gets in the way of what standard out and standard error are doing, where we had to do a lot of work around what writes to like the diagnostic output of I am currently the program printing. I'm currently running your transform script. You've typed print inside of your transform script, and so that should print somewhere. And we had to separate that from the result of the transform, which is in this case a data set.
Something that I just thought of. The way that we had it before, we had this really tight coupling between saving with a transform file and running the transform. And it was kind of like, by tying those two together, we had taken 2 steps forward. And then things like dry run, but also recall were like taking a step back to kind of get you to cover other use cases. And the proposal of this RFC is making each of those separate steps, I guess is one way to put it. So yeah, it's like executing the transform is now an explicit step. And I think as a result, yeah, recall also will go away. Like you don't need it.
You won't need it.
Yeah. If you want to run, go ahead.
I actually have a question about that. And I don't know why it's not, I feel like I've answered the question for myself several times after reading your thing, and it just doesn't stick in my head.
No problem.
I don't totally understand what happens on save. Like, is this changing the behavior of save to save no longer run the transform if you're not checked out? So if there's no FSI and you're using transforms, does save run the transform, or is apply doing something else? Is apply make any sense except for in a dry run context when you are not FSI linked?
Right, that's a super good question. It doesn't explicitly say that in the RFC, which you are correctly pointing out. I think if we make it's easy to fall into a place where the user is surprised by the behavior. So I feel like the old behavior where when you pass a transform to save just as a file, that should actually be an error because it's ambiguous what you want to do with it. You might just be writing a transform to run in a later version. So I think when you save with a I don't know if this is correct, but my current thoughts are when you save with a transform, you should either have to specify like something like no apply, or you like pass the apply flag or something like that.
Interesting. Otherwise, and if you pass apply, sorry, and let's say you pass apply and you have an older version, would that necessarily replace recall?
Yes.
Cool. So it's saying, hey, whatever transform thing you have in storage for me, or the file you're passing in, apply that on this save. That's
the way I think it should work. Yeah.
Cool.
I kind of want to like build a prototype and like try it out. I think that's the only good way to get a feel for what really works. Chris, what was the thing you were going to say? You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. More or less trying to ask the same question is, if I understand this correctly, I can explicitly run a transform. Can I run a transform without saving it and get like a staged change? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, so if you're checked out, then it'll write to the body in that checked out directory. And if you're not, it's like running dry run. You'll see it on standard out.
Okay, but I wouldn't have to say dry run. It's just, I would have to explicitly say I want to save also while I'm running it.
No, I think you would do query apply and then the data set name, and it would run the transform that it has. Or you pass in a transform if you're currently writing it.
Okay, got it. Sorry, hold on. I need to step away for a second.
No problem. But to answer that question, yeah, I think if you want to run the transform but not save it, you don't use save. You say query apply, and then the data set name, optionally passing in the transform file. Yeah, I think that's the way it would work.
Yeah, I think this also gets to the other sort of like tripping point that we've really come across, which is the default, just to set up the scenario. So we use the phrase FSI, that just to link that terminology, that's file system integration, which is the exact same as Git. So if you have a Git checkout, like it's a folder that anything in there should behave like a two-way street to query. And if you just type query save in that folder, you're going to get everything in that folder just gets smashed into a commit. And so you get this nice interaction where you can type query status and it'll say, hey, your body's changed. And let's pretend we name it, and I think the convention that people are sort of getting at, and Rusty, I'd like to do a sense check with you here, is like if I make a file in there called transform.star and I put it in there, and I want to be able to do two things. I want to be able to develop that script, sort of work on it and understand what it's going to do. And then I want to be able to save and have that transform be applied to the data set upon save. I also want the expectation that I think a number of folks who are initially playing with transforms came back with is, what I would also like is if I hit save again, I want the transform to run again, which was this old default that we talked about a bunch way in the past, of the idea that the whole idea of a lot of transform scripts should just run on every save and keep running. And this is where we had the idea of like, of recall, because we had to come up with this idea of recall because we were like, oh, we realized for technical reasons, it's really not great to have a default of like always rerunning the same transform, because you can end up in states where like, how do I remove, I have to actively sort of opt out of the transform running. And so when you're not checked out of a directory and you don't have this cognitive model of like, these are the files I would like them to be saved, it's a little harder to sort of understand what's going to happen at any given moment. And it also makes it really hard to sort of change the scripts in a sort of meaningful way. And so for that reason, Dustin, you can actually also jump in here, because I think I'm slightly sort of trotting on how these two use cases would work. But if I understand this properly, what I would love to see happen is like I can do query apply and I can name a transform.star file. And if I'm in an FSI link directory, if I'm in a checked out directory, it will use that data set as the thing that if I just ran query apply in a data set directory that's checked out and there's a file called transform.star, it would run it. That checkout so far. And I think I actually don't think that should write to the file system. I think that should print to the console.
I would say it should do both. Because if I have the body open in an editor or another app, like it'll be updated basically.
But then that's going to destructively change my local files, right?
Right, but we want to avoid the situation where a user is manually editing. This is talked about in the RFC. We want to avoid the situation where a user is manually editing the body and also running transforms because of this exact problem. You don't want to lose data. So running, we want to ideally have it so that if you run apply and if the body matches what it is at head, the most recent commit, it should modify it. And the only other time it should modify it is if it was the result of a previous apply operation.
The result of a previous apply operation.
Yeah. So in other words, if you can't like modify it. What was that?
Go ahead, Rusty.
He's basically saying that if you apply, if you're iterating and you apply it and you don't like that iteration, then you just apply, you change the star, you change transform script, apply again, and it's like working in your Git directory, and it'll apply to either a virgin directory that is exactly what was pulled down, or something you've only used apply on. And then if you try to run it on something you've edited by hand, it'll say, I can't apply that unless you revert this directory or force it or something. And so it'd be just like, making 2 saves in your text editor before you do a commit. So if you do 2 script changes and 2 applies, well, the previous apply didn't count because you never committed it. So it's just like starting from 0.
Right.
That's how I understand it.
Yes.
And I could like fix that pretty easily with, I could like if a body was manually.
Hold on, you're echoing a bunch.
Yeah, Rusty, I'm gonna control your mute. I apologize. We get a lot of feedback from your mic. I'm so sorry. And I could fix that pretty easily with restore, right? I can do.
If you checked out, yeah.
Yeah, so like if I have a body that I mess with or I get in a weird state and I want to fix something, I can just type query restore body in that directory. And
we should do we should do as much work as possible to prevent the situation where someone is manually editing a file and running apply at the same time.
Right.
And I think we can do that efficiently and easily in a way that's like clear.
So do others agree with that? Do we think that feels like the right sort of like setup? It's kind of complicated. I do want to see it being used.
The addition doesn't well thought out. What I was so instead of where I wish, hey, have not at all lead and transform sort of and say change or it's been changed by just completely within more. In their case, you can multiple scripts. But as long as there's one and you're on that, it's sort of there you can on the script.
Sorry, Rusty, we couldn't hear you. I don't know if you're still there.
Your audio was your audio was coming super slow. We could hear you, but it was like a quarter speed.
I like the idea from Chris. Try typing it.
Is my audio still broken?
That's
Sounds better now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's better now? Okay. Well, I muted and unmuted. You want to go through it again? Okay. Just put your hand up if it's not doing right. It's basically what I proposed. Be able to make a hand edit with an editor, or a grid editor or whatever, or make a scripted edit with a transform script. And that's what I proposed, but my proposal had no real safety there. And by checking to see it, that's either a fresh checkout or the only thing that you've run before is it's the result of a transform script, then it basically saves some checking, and really there's no potential loss if it doesn't check for that. It's just more hassle to check in. So if it could be implemented correctly, that would make things a lot smoother for the people running that way. But yeah, it's just two ways to edit it by hand or edit with a script, and it only lets one go in on a query. And I love it, and thank you. And I'm muting.
Cool, that sounds good. Glad to hear. The more I think about it too, I think the cases where we detect that a user has done both, we can use the differ to also tell like what was manually edited and like suggest that they make separate commits for it or restore it or whatever. Like we can actually figure out that there's been 2 things at once.
I love it. Yeah, for a little while we've been striving for the idea of like being able to do both at the same time. And I think hearing everyone talk, this is like way easier to get your head around. You're either doing a manual edit or you're doing a scripted edit, and it's just simpler as a mental model. And until someone begs for a difference, I think it's easier to work this way.
I mean, we're implementing like Google Docs style editing or Etherpad style editing, possibly way down the road, but like that's not a near-term goal.
I don't think you should. Sorry.
No, please, you first.
Go ahead. I don't think you should try to offer to sort of split up the edits. I think if you detect a clash, don't apply the transform and pop an error, and then say, you've edited by hand, commit this before you run this transforms again. I don't think you should make any effort to try to merge them in one. That's all.
Awesome. This club is formed. So yeah, Case.
I just had a comment that's only slightly off topic, and it has to do with apply, specifically because we're looking to expand apply to relate to a number of things. We just have been talking, whenever we talk about apply right now, we've just been assuming that it's transform. And I'm curious about how we specify that when we're saving, when we're just applying to, saying that a lot. Yeah, so, and that like, I'd like to know what language we're going to use to talk about that, so I could start talking about it like that now and have that in my brain that apply is for multiple things.
Application, the act of applying.
Yeah, we could have like an app store.
Right. Part of what I added to the RFC recently is that we don't want to make the definition too general, because then it'll just be like, it'll be the same thing as running code. There should be
do stuff.
Right. We should define what we want to get out of apply. And I think, things like being able to detect conflicts is like a big part of it. Kind of a lot of things the RFC talks about is like taking inspiration from functional programming, where there's reproducibility and idempotency and things like that, so that we can kind of act in safe ways to wrangle state changes and control them. And I think having questions like that answered will really say what apply doesn't apply to, so that we can really talk about it in more concrete ways.
And I think you've really hit the nail on the head. And I would propose that we go one step further and be very precise about this and say that applying something is the conceptual model of calling a function on one or more data sets. So the only thing that can be in the input is data sets. The function is the script itself, and the output is exactly one data set.
Even more, I think the output should be like one or more components or pseudo components.
Yep. And if you want to be really precise, a data set itself is a component of a data set, which is gnarly and weird. But
things like stat would apply, because stat is a pseudo component that we save. But like, I don't think diff should. I think diff is like a primitive.
I don't think diff is at all an apply domain thing. Personally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Because the output of diff is inherently a script that tells you how to turn one data set into another data set. It's not.
Yeah, it's a building block that we use in other places. So yeah, I think once we have that, it's easier for a user to think about apply as like, oh, this is somehow, it goes back to the state transition idea. It's a state transition from some data set and some like thing that tells you how to apply, and then you end up somewhere similar, but what you do with that is kind of mutable.
Yeah.
I'm also curious. Sorry. I'm curious about how does apply remove or overlap with render? The way that you render a viz, is apply take over that responsibility, rendering a viz or rendering a README, which we don't save rendered READMEs, but we do save rendered vizzes right now. So just curious.
Yeah, totally. It would.
Yeah.
Also, it's been 30 minutes on this one RFC.
I
We
know.
should,
I'm
wrap up
going
at
to
some
power
point.
through this. I think this is the second most ambiguous one. So I want to answer. So I just want to make sure that we get some clarity here. And then we at least get one done. If we have to punt on one of them, we'll be fine. But the last thing I want to, not the last thing I want to say, and then anyone else can have the last word on this, is to your point, Casey, applying a viz would just affect the viz component, right? And so that's where the result is a component of a data set. And if you wanted, for simplicity's sake, to have it if you want the return to be a data set, you could sort of have that, and you only accepted one data set as input, that you could just return, like flow through, say, hey, you gave me this data set and you said apply this viz. And so you get the old data set with the viz component updated. Questionable, but what I think this is really, whether I think this is really important is for SQL, because we really want to be able to have it. Chris has mocked up a wireframe that says, run this SQL query that may join 2 or more data sets. And the result of that should be saved as a data set itself. And that SQL SQL statement is this, it's now the transform syntax is no longer starlark. The syntax is SQL. And the script is the SQL query itself. And that makes it reapplicable, right? And so that data set is now naturally locked in the land of being a SQL thing, and you'd have to like, and it's nice because you get an update button really easily for it, right? But what apply, the language of apply gets us much closer to that world, and I think that's really valuable considering we have like active wireframes that will be doing that today. And so I think it's worth us, like, this is part of the reason why we really wanted to loop things like render and SQL into the universe of apply. And I think the cutoff line that diff elucidates really nicely is the output has to be something data set-y, either a component of a data set or a data set itself. And I really think that we should emphasize only one. So the output should always be singular. So like we should never have transform or apply functions that result in multiple data sets. That feels, because what I think is better there is you can use, if it's a single return, then you can pipeline them together. And we can get into a situation where multiple functions can be called and their return value is always going to be one thing. It gets really complicated if you try and do multiple returns. But anybody want to close that out, or do we want to move on to the next RFC? I promise the others will not be this controversial. Cool, I feel like we have a lot to go on there. All right, so the next one I want to move on to is the push-pull RFC. Basically, the biggest thing I want to get a thumbs up on around here is the language of push-pull. I wrote this one, so I'm going to talk about it really quickly. And could somebody link in the chat to the actual RFC document? It's a pull request on the RFC thing. Long story short, we have, right now we have the notion of, we have a couple of terms floating around, and we have some problems with the way that data sets are moved between peers. Right now, when you type, the current command is called publish, and when you type query publish, it pushes the logbook data, which is the history of the data set's sort of version changes, and the latest version only, which is getting us into a very rough state where if somebody makes 5 commits, hits publish, 4 commits are missing from the thing they published to. And so then other users are having trouble getting the actual commit data. The history of those commits is sent because the logbook data contains, hey, this is a data set whose history is 5 commits long. But the actual data, the actual data set block information itself is no longer on the, is not in the destination that received the thing that you published to. And then conversely, add or clone, or we've used words like add and clone. We use clone on Query Cloud, and we use add in Query CLI and in Query Desktop, and we've been trying to harmonize that language. Is the idea of pulling a data set down, pulling a data set from you to someone else. And the problem there is we lack a degree of sophistication to be able to say, I would like to pull a specific version of a data set or a specific version for master. We're just missing a little bit of API sort of flexibility to be able to say, I would like to pull all of the versions of this data set. And right now add only defaults to just adding the latest version, which works in many contexts, but doesn't in a lot of other contexts. And so what this RFC proposes is dropping the language of add and publish and unpublish and clone, and instead just doing push and pull. I want to push this data set from here to somewhere else, and push is now greedy. It pushes as much data as possible. And so it'll say, if I do query push me to you, and I have 5 commits, I'm trying to send you 5 commits. You as the receiver get to decide how many you'd like to accept because it's your hard drive. And so you may just, and right now the RFC just says basically if you don't like it or it's above a sort of set number that you get to decide of how much space each data set can take up, it'll just error. And we have a follow-up strategy or follow-up conversation on retention strategies that we can deal with later. But this RFC just defines like a greedy push and a conservative pull with a richer API. And so the biggest thing I want to talk about on this one is the language, push and pull. Personally, I advocate for them very hard because I think that they are simple action-based metaphors that imply where the data is going and who is doing the initiation. When I type query push, I think it really helps for me to say, I am pushing data somewhere. I think publish gets a little ambiguous, and I think publish is only going to get worse over time as we have the notion of access controlled data sets. It'll feel very strange to query publish a private data set or an encrypted data set. That will feel, to me, will feel really odd. And will take some explaining. And I think that it sort of doesn't get at the point, right? The point is I'm trying to move data around. I'm not trying to, the publicity is sort of a secondary effect. And then on the pull side, I like pull because it matches Git. I'm gonna admit to that. I like the idea that in my day-to-day workflow, I type Git pull a lot, and pull really helps me think about what am I doing? I'm grabbing the latest. I'm sort of pulling to me the latest thing that I have, and it's an easy thing to sort of like push someone towards. Push someone towards pulling. Yeah, language. Anyways, I'll open up the floor. That's my pitch. I think we should do this.
First, a question. Before we had this notion where if I like list another peer's data sets, I'll see only the stuff that they have marked as published. Is that changing at all, or is that still happening here?
This RFC doesn't address that at all. The notion of local publicity, listed or unlisted. Yeah.
Okay. Just curious if that was.
Yeah. That should be dealt with.
I will say most of my questions after reading the RFC surrounded, besides storage, and how it relates to the next RFC, but was surrounding the language that we use, how removing the word publish. How removing the word publish relates to all of the ways we've been talking about publish on desktop and like clarity around that. But to answer your question, I'm bought into push pull. I think it's also like, even if you're not a Git user, I know we're saying that like it's part of what's good for people who are familiar with Git is that it is similar language. I think it's also good for people who don't have a concept. It's easy to tell what you're doing. You're pushing this to somewhere else. You're pulling it from something else.
When it comes to, I think I asked this when we talked about it internally, and I can't remember the response. But yeah, how do I unpush once I've published something, or put something on Query Cloud that I don't want to be on Query Cloud anymore? The analog to that in Git is you have to go into there's probably an API or command for it somewhere, but it's not really part of Git. It's GitHub, GitHub going into web UI and going into the danger zone in the settings and saying, yes, I want to remove this. Do we have something like that in mind for, for the registry, the first registry or the primary registry or the primary remote, I guess we'll call it?
The registry, yeah. Yes, that's what the storage RFC covers because it's left. That is left as an open question from our last conversation. And so the storage RFC basically says, I do query storage drop and I name the remote. And I say query storage drop blah, and that'll let me do it locally. As you just said, when it comes to Query Cloud, 99% of people should be just using the cloud interface on the web API to say, just delete this, drop this, get rid of this. And I think that's what people should do. And we should ship that. Dustin.
This is a bit of a tangent. I don't want to get too far off course, but I thought storage is only about storage and not about history. So it's separate from whether something has been pushed, whether a version has been pushed, right? Because we're not talking, like, pulling something off of cloud isn't just delete the storage. It's like, stop advertising this version that I pushed by accident, right?
Yeah, I think all of these questions really point to an unresolved thing that needs to be answered before this RFC can move forward, which is how do we deal with publicity, which has been sort of carved around and then left unanswered by this RFC.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do think the names are good. I'll just put that out there.
Yeah, and I think that we've sort of been like beating around the bush around the idea of access control, or at least some preliminary access control. And I think that there's a question here about that, where this RFC quickly mentions that like we don't, right now you need to be able to push to a remote. And so we're just using a sort of hacky way of saying, I'm going to manually name my remotes the same way you do in Git, which is not going to be necessary long-term, where because we have the capacity to sort of say, everybody knows who everybody else is in the system because we have public key, private key infrastructure in place. And so I think, yeah, before this can move forward, I think we basically need to answer the question about how do I unlist something? How do I unpublish, as it were, in the old world? And I think that should probably coincide with access control. Even if we don't actually write the rest of the access control, we just have that as the suite of things.
That really seems orthogonal to me. Because I mean, right now, if you want to unpublish something, you have to own it. It's just, it's like a string comparison or whatever. It's like, did I push this? Am I still me?
Totally. Yeah, it's a good point. Maybe the access control is a bridge too far. Yeah, maybe it's just still query published and query unpublished, just change their meaning. They only affect.
Or I don't know if this is a terrible idea, but like push -- unpush. I don't know. Undo. Push undo.
Push in a circle.
The opposite of pushing is pulling, but like that's not what we mean here, right?
Yeah.
And I think unpushing is like part of. I don't know if we need a separate command, and I think if you were to combine it with any command, it would be push.
Query push undo.
Right.
Yeah, but there's also the thing that there's the difference between I want to unpublish this totally and I need to manage the storage on the remote that is not letting me push another version. One is remove, like you said, Dustin, remove the logs, get rid of all evidence, and the other is crap, I really want the latest version, but my remote only has this much storage. How do I manage that? Yeah, go on.
I think something that would be really good is like kind of conversations, like basically have a section where it's like here, like a user story, and then show the commands that would be used for that case and see if it looks sane or not.
Yeah.
Because that's what we keep coming back to. It's like, what would it look like to solve problem A, problem B, problem C?
Yeah, to agree on that. Okay, this is great because I think, so Casey, to your point, I think the answer to that first question is query storage drop blah, and drop with the remote. I can just say query storage drop registry this thing. I can name a specific commit. I can name a range of commits. I can go crazy, and that'll say, cool. That's how I manually manipulate things to get myself out of a bad storage situation. And then we should totally write a user story and propose and extend this RFC to talk about how we're going to deal with publicity. Almost made it over the line. But I think this also addresses storage, which we can sort of loop in with this because we've kind of had this conversation here too. How do others feel about this? So how do others feel about the storage command? I think it's just something that we need personally.
I had a question about being a remote and having access to things that other people have pushed and what responsibilities the remote has to their pushies, if any. Once someone's pushed the data set to me, is that as if it is in my query list, like I can look at it and have control over it like a data set that I have pulled? Or is there some other, that was a big question that I had. Also, no, I think you answered this, but I don't think it was specified in the RFC that if you don't have either registry or a remote specified, you're looking at your own storage. Just wanted to double check.
Yeah, totally. And I think so the RFC on storage or on remotes goes a little bit into the defaults. Basically, all of this is delegated and must be completely customizable by the remote receiver. So by default, no remote accepts anything from anybody. You have to explicitly allow specific users to push to you. The only place that just does blanket accepting of data sets is the registry. Yeah, and the whether or not things show up in list is going to be up to each remote and their configuration. I think by default the answer is yeah. If you have named somebody that you're willing to accept data sets, basically this is the equivalent of friending on social media. It's like, all right, I'll let you. We're friends. I will repeat what you say. I trust you, right? And this is at the sort of like human level. This is about trust. And it's about pride, it's about trust, and in this case it's sorry, it's yeah, you're just saying I'm going to let this person work, send stuff to me, and so I'm going to repeat what they have. If once we solve this publicity question, the publicity setting should match whatever the user sets as the publicity is, and so like if they say, hey, say we have query list as or no, query publish or query make available. And other people can see that, and that's been typed, and that's now part of the history of the data set. When that gets sent, I will honor that same setting. And so it'll just be on a per data set basis, which will allow me to say, don't make this available, but push this to my friend. And so that will not show up in their query list or my query list, because we don't want that other people to see that, right? Basically the idea of an unlisted data set moving around trusted counterparts, which is a really important thing, right? Like you want to be able to say, only you and I should see this data set, but I want to get it to you. Okay, gotta keep moving, 10 minutes. But we did, the only one left is config, which I think config, I think we should skip a lot of the details for config and just talk about private key externalization. Yeah, or actually before we do that, because there's only 10 minutes left, and maybe what we should do instead, yeah, I'm going to make a total right turn here and say that that's going to be a big conversation that we should save for an asynchronous chat and not waste precious time, not spend precious time sort of like generating first thoughts there on the call. Instead, Ashwin, I'd like to just take this last 10 minutes and ask, like, how are you doing? Like, what do you want to engage with? How can we help support your open source endeavors with Query and make sure that we're sort of like, yeah, setting you up for success?
Yeah, thank you. I came across Query when I was trying to, use Google Docs to catalog something, and I just came across this through the New York Open Data Week event, which I was not able to make it. But I've been following you guys pretty much, like watching your videos, trying to understand how the platform works. I'm actually a newbie to Go. I'm mostly a C++, developer. So I'm learning both at the same time. So anything I can add of value, that'd be great to allow me to learn as I go, as well as be, as small a contributor as I can be. And so that's why I said SQL could be something I could latch on to, because it sounds like you guys have already built out, the wiring, if you will, and then it's about adding more incremental features.
Absolutely, it's totally fantastic. I had no idea you're just coming to Go. Like like you discovered it. Well, it's super helpful because like I didn't know JSON that indent existed until your PR came across. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't need to like re-marshal it or like deal with that or a number of ways.
Yeah.
And so that was really cool to see. You may be new, but you're clearly a quick study. But
thank you.
Yeah, and I do not consider that in any way a small contribution. I think that one of the things I hadn't bothered to mention anyone else, but as soon as I saw your PR come in, I'm like, we should just make the pretty printing the default, because like stats, you're gonna try and read that data output. Like you shouldn't have to like try and grok through. And so I would gladly accept a PR from somebody that makes default true for pretty printing. Yeah, the SQL stuff in particular is really, that's a biggie. And this is actually a chance for us to really flex some open source muscle. On the SQL stuff, we really want to make sure that we become upstream contributors back to the project that we're depending on, which is called OctoSQL. And so for us, there are a number of places where this can happen. Chris has been doing a lot of our lead on the what commands do we need to make sure are in place, and what functions do we need to make sure are in place to make that our SQL implementation robust and useful for our use case, which is a lot of the work, Chris, that you're doing. I'll shut up and not put words in your mouth in a second, but was trying to join data sets, and he was missing a number of key features in the SQL language that are, I think, really important to make a good experience. Chris, do you want to speak to any of that, some of your work trying to do stuff like case and join?
Yeah, I mean, just the like, I'll do a like very common example in New York City open data is joining the borough code from one data set to, borough, a 2-character borough abbreviation. So like BK is Brooklyn, but it's actually borough code 3 on another list that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I need to be able to just add a case statement so I can make them, make one or the other the same, so I can do a join on them on data sets that I don't want to edit, so I need to be able to do that on the fly. So little stuff like that, lowercasing things and just lots of sort of on the fly manipulation of things just so you can make stuff line up between disparate data sets.
And just to try and connect some train cars here, Ashwin, is like the idea that, so we have kind of like, because we have an upstream dependency, we want to know a couple of things, right? Because we're not principally in charge of that code. Some of what Chris just said, I think the ideal place for us to start with a situation like that is actually PRing in a failing test case, where we say, hey, what we would like to see is this behavior. And so like a unit test that just says, I would try to run a SQL case statement inside of query, prove that it fails, and then add skip. In Go's testing language, you can do t.skip now, which will make the test suite still pass, but show that, hey, this needs to be skipped. And that's effectively commenting out the test case without actually commenting out the code. And that will give us some assurances. If we do that first and then go to the upstream PR to OctoSQL and see if they will accept it, make sure that it behaves the way that we want it to, as we're sort of like, because the sort of feedback loop is a little slower, we're making sure that we're sending stuff to another project. They have their own checks and balances and approval processes. We want to make sure that the code that we're sending is actually shipping the thing that is useful to us in the long run. So there's the project of writing the code, but there's also before that the project of like the guarantees around this. And I think that this also ties into some of what you were chatting with Holger and Asmir on Discord about, where this idea of null values is showing up, and just like having a test case, again, just fleshing out the test suite of stuff we would like to see out of our SQL implementation is a really great way to sort of cut your teeth on Go as a language, because it's, how do I compose really elegant tests is a really useful thing. And on us, like as core contributors, I think it's a really useful exercise, because we've uncovered a number of patterns that we think that we feel pretty strongly about when it comes to writing tests for Go. Specifically, the one that we love is this test runner pattern that has emerged, where you basically define a structure that says, hey, I'm gonna be the structure that is gonna help do all the boilerplate setup for running a test. And so like, I don't think we have a test runner for SQL stuff. If we don't, we should write one. But then, yeah, if you're looking for like those nice PRs where it's like basically like 1-2 unit tests, you got a little time somewhere, and someone wants a case statement, we can make a point of filing issues around the types of functions that we would like to see exist. And then if someone were to pick that up and say, if you were interested, you could pick that up, write a unit test that proves that that thing doesn't presently work. And then either somebody either on our team or otherwise can do an upstream pull request to make that work. And then we'll know when it works. And we can sort of like cascade all the way back down, which is long and long-winded, but I think it's the right way to make sure that our implementation of SQL improves over time, and that we're observing a lot of moving pieces. The actual spec of the SQL language, which is a bit fuzzy, depending on which flavor you like, the implementation that we're dependent on, and then the end result for our query, for our actual query users. And so a lot of this, it's a lot of moving pieces, but does any of that make sense? And does that feel like something you'd be interested in? Or have I accurately sort of like given you something to grasp onto?
Yeah, I think it's a good, like you said, it's good foray into, doing proper test-driven development in Go. If one of you can lead me on to like which features and sub features within SQL you guys wanted me to write the tests for, then that would be a good place to start.
That's perfect, because yeah, Chris, you've already written the document on some of your like top of mind things that you care about. If we took those, translated them into issues, and in those issues just asked for a test case that proves that this is failing, that will make for a really nice first iteration, and then we can sort of work through those. And Ashwin, we'll make a point of in review for that, like trying to do best form and really making sure that we're sort of showing what we are best to our knowledge, how to write good Go code. Not all of the code that we write is great Go code, but a lot of it is not so bad, in my opinion. Yeah. Is that helpful?
Very much. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. This is so nice to have you come by, and it's really exciting. Also, with all open source, this comes with a caveat of like, you're here voluntarily, no pressure, don't feel like you're on a deadline. It's those of us on the call who are sort of like involved in query the company are in charge of making sure this stuff gets done. But yeah, thank you. And any time if you have or would like to come hang out, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Cool. I'm glad we punted on the externalization of the private key thing. That's like a whole half-hour chat. So let's have that conversation asynchronously. I'm going to make a point of adding at least that to the config RFC about how we can externalize this. But Rusty, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Rusty, who like has really uncovered this scary thing in query where if you blow away your .query repo, you get into a whole nightmare. And so thank you, Rusty, for hanging in there with a totally borked.
Thank you for breaking stuff.
Yes, thank you for breaking stuff. Because the sooner that you break it, if someone who's willing to talk about it breaks it, we can fix it. If someone breaks it and then never tells us, we can't fix it. And then it's just like if a tree falls in the woods, does anyone hear it? And the answer is if software doesn't run and nobody files a bug. I don't know, there's some metaphor there. Pretend I said that in an elegant and fanciful way. But yeah, with that, next call is next Monday, not this Monday, next Monday. Is that correct, Rico?
Yep, no meetings next week.
And then a follow-up on the following Friday. But yeah, with that, thank you so much, everybody. Have a lovely weekend,
Thanks
wherever
so much,
you are in the
Ashwin.
world. And yeah, we'll see you around.
Welcome. See you around.